Hey, all, welcome to today's edition of Now We're Talking with Doug Pagitt. Today I'm talking with Kent Dobson. Kent is a good friend, and I consider him to be a master teacher. And I like to think of him as, my own little spiritual teacher on a number of important issues. Kent's book is Bitten by a Camel. Totally worth picking up. I really, really recommend it. But in this conversation, Kent and I get into a whole number of issues around the kind of work that he's doing in the world, a lot of things with personal growth, soul work, spirit work, narratives in people's lives. It's just super fun for me. I think you're going to enjoy it as well. You can find Kent. He's got his own podcast going with a thing called Hints and Guesses. So look up Kent Dobson, KentDobson.com if you want to be part of that. And while you're .comming, DougPagitt.com for the Patreon link. I would appreciate you chipping in if you're so inclined, especially at this holiday season. You know, when you give a little something to your postal carrier and the gal that comes and picks up your garbage on the back of that truck, you slip them a little something. At least I hope you do. You're a little gracious to all the people that service you in your life in this kind of grateful holiday-like way. Well, be sure you pay all those people first. And if you have anything left at the end, go over to Patreon and chip it in. You can find it at DougPagitt.com. Thanks for being part of all of this. And if you want to be on my newsletter for the organization Greater Things that I organize, or to keep up on any of the work that I do at Solomon's Porch or other places, also over there at DougPagitt.com, you can sign up for the email list. So here it is, a fantastic conversation that I'm thankful for on this week of Thanksgiving with Kent Dobson. Welcome to Now We're Talking with Doug Pagitt. Kent and I are now talking.
Hey.
Hey, Kent.
Hey, good to talk with you.
Thank you. Nice to talk with you. Kent Dobson is famous for a number of things. Wouldn't you say, Kent? Wouldn't you say you're famous for a number of things?
Why don't you tell me? Because that's how it works. Other people say you're famous for a number of things.
Well, among the more important things you're famous for, it is being the author of this fantastic book, Bitten by a Camel. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So it's just fun to, put in the headliner, Kent Dobson, Bitten by a Camel. People are already saying on Facebook, love the book. Just simply saying, I'm talking with Kent Dobson. People already love the book. Kent, you helped to start a church once in your life. You have lived in Israel. You now have a new bit of work you're doing with a spiritual community in Grand Rapids. You're a triathlete. You are a teacher of the human developmental system and process to help people grow as full and complete human beings to the greatest of their potential. I mean, the number of things that you, my friend, endeavor on is quite impressive.
Thanks, Doug. I appreciate it. So, those are the things.
What's that?
I said, yeah, those are the things I'm into.
That's right. Really are the things. So talk a little bit about now where you are. And we'll talk about the book, Bitten by a Camel, which people are already saying is such a great book. They love it. I'll ask you later about the movie rights. And that's only because I'm talking with a person named Dan Gilroy later who's just made a movie with Denzel Washington. So I thought,
just slip him a copy.
Should talk about the movie rights. Ken, say something about this community that you're working with now. Some people might know you from being a part of a spiritual community in Grand Rapids, Michigan called Mars Hill, which you've been part of for a long time. But that's not what you're doing with your work and personal life now.
Yeah, believe it or not, 2 years ago this month, really this week, I stepped away from Mars Hill in Michigan. And I've done a number of things since then. But yes, I am part of a spiritual community here. It's actually in Grand Haven, Michigan, called C3. It used to be a church about 10 to 15 years ago, and then they dropped their doctrinal affiliations. They took the cross down. They sold their building. They meet in a community center, and they're very inclusive. Before that was like a thing that churches were into.
Like before Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. It's really interesting. It's a good mixture of people. It's small. It's very conversational. So I teach about half the Sundays of the year, and the format we meet on Sundays, and the format's really interesting because both before and after there is a conversation around the topic of the day. So that makes it somewhat unique. And then we just have local musicians, local folk.
That's fantastic.
Really amazing freaking musicians every single week. They find awesome people, and they have for a long time. So yeah, I feel kind of lucky. That's what I'm doing with half the Sundays of the year now.
A small, conversational, inclusive community with local musicians. What people wouldn't give to be part of one of those?
Yeah, isn't that what you're already doing, Doug?
So let me ask you about that. You found that you've been in different spiritual communities in different places in your life. Why do you think there aren't more places like this that the C3s of the world? They seem like they're more doable, right? Conversation is something people are prepared for, and if you don't have to have a whole lot of people, why aren't there more of these? How come people don't do these more often?
I don't know. I think probably it's going to take more mainline churches and mega churches collapsing, and then as people pick up the pieces and say, "Hey, what do we want to do with ourselves? How can we own this instead of the big institution own this?" Almost everyone that's a part of the community I am is a volunteer. The whole thing runs with barely any overhead, as opposed to these massive institutions with, bills and taxes on land and all kinds of stuff. So I don't know. I think people are creative, just in a sense, hand it over to the people, and they come up with something that reflects their local situation, their local questions and desires and hopes.
What do you talk about when you're there? So if it's a spiritual community that doesn't have a doctrinal Christian, at least a Christian doctrinal orientation, it's hard to imagine for a lot of people, and I don't even know that any functioning communities exist that don't hold some kind of a sacred story of some variety, right? Some impassioning, enlivening, animating narrative that moves them forward in the world. And for a lot of people, that's their version of their religion, or of their personal transformation, or of their addiction, overcoming their addictions or something. There's lots of ways that people have many, many kinds of narratives. What do you, when Kent is there and you're one of the speakers, what do you tend to talk about in the midst of your conversation with that group of people?
Well, let me say two things. First of all, we would call ourselves a values-based community. So if you look on our website, c3westmichigan.org, or if you're there one week and you look at the bulletin, there are 6 values. And that is a kind of narrative that grounds us. And we tend to rotate topically around these values. So when I'm there, I talk about whatever I want, but usually generally rooted in a value. So for example, I'm doing a 3-week series on the question, what is wild? So I'm talking about wild, I'm talking about wilderness, I'm talking about the wild within. And where is that situated? That's situated in our value of environmental sustainability. So those are the kinds of things I'm talking about. A lot of time I'm just hovering around things that I'm really interested in, like soul, myths, stories. I'll throw in stuff it's funny because I'll throw in stuff from the Bible, and it's been a while since they've had someone talking about a story from the Bible, and they appreciate it. They're like, oh, it's like old times talking about the Bible. So it's really funny and life-giving, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. What are the 6 values? Do you know them off the top here? Is it the kind of thing people memorize, or is it not a place where you worry about that? Like, you don't have to know them.
No, I do not have them memorized.
Are they words or sentences? Like, are they just a word like love, joy, peace, patience?
No, that's why I don't have them memorized. Yeah. It's a little more in depth. I'll look at them real quick because it'll just take me 2 seconds.
Yeah.
So common humanity. So we respect the dignity and worth of every human individual, or every individual. Diversity.
That's a good one.
So these are one-word things.
Yeah.
We affirm all people and embrace all genders, sexual orientations, and ethnicities. Open inquiry, like We pursue free exchange of ideas, explore the lessons of science, philosophy, the creative arts, and undertake independent spiritual journeys. Not everyone there is Christian. I mean, there are some atheists and Buddhists and Jews, and compassionate action is one of our values. We strive to safeguard and extend human rights, peace, and social justice locally and globally. Environmental sustainability, we care for the earth with mindfulness, responsibility for ourselves and future generations. I know I'm going fast, but well-being. We promote wholeness and wellness of mind, body, and spirit, recognizing our self-responsibility and interrelatedness and interdependence. So these are like, I think,
it's got all the words in it. Yeah, that's right. It's great. It's got all the words in it. All the things that people that you and I like hanging around and talk to and talk with want to be part of. I love it.
Yeah, they're kind of hard won, I think. When you step away from a denomination, a tradition, a story, it's hard to find your feet. So these values aren't just like a bunch of millennials sitting around, saying, hey, what are the kind of things that we like?
Coming up with a set of buzzwords and saying, that these are the sort of, they're the best case reflection on what's got them to this point, is what you're saying.
That's right. Yeah.
If you can do this little thought experiment with me, 9 years ago, I don't know, 11 years ago, if Kent Dobson had run across C3 the way it is now, what would that Kent have thought about that place or that project or what was going on?
Probably I would have thought, this is the future. I don't think I would have been turned off by it. I think I would have been intrigued by it. I would have probably at the time wondered, how can a place exist without a tradition, so to speak? Rituals, rites. I was never a big fan of doctrines, but just some sort of like common narrative.
Yeah.
It turns out, people like Joseph Campbell or Carl Jung say the common narrative is in the deep psyche. So, as long as you're in a place that's having conversations around stories, values, myths, philosophy, science, you're going to stumble upon the perennial tradition and upon the deep structure of the human psyche.
So rather than saying you have to manufacture some other narrative that people are going to organize around, you're saying there's this shared human experience, and that's what we can organize ourselves around, to use the other tools to find ourselves into that story, into that common human soul, that common human psyche or experience.
I think so. That is kind of an assumption I'm toying with, or I hold. I guess I kind of believe that at this point. And that really comes from, people like Jung, who said that the deep structure of the psyche is archetypal, and it recognizes itself, and there's a certain aim and direction. It recognizes itself in stories and dreams and conversations and images, and they're not specific to any one religious tradition. So again, you get up and tell a story on a Sunday morning or any time, and why do people resonate with a story? The characters, the issues, problems, and they can be wildly different stories. What wakes up inside someone? That's what I'm interested in, because I think something wakes up. And if it happens to be a specifically Christian narrative, fine. But let's just be honest that the quote Christian narrative was Jewish to begin with. So we already know it's not ours. It's coming from some other place,
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about, I don't consider myself a very spiritual person in the classic spirituality terms, right? So I don't know why that is. I don't know why I've sort of decided that there's a category of spirituality and it's not really me. But in the last 5 or 7 years, I've been really toying with the idea of being on a spiritual path, being in a spiritual way, living in a spiritual, with a set of animating forces in my life that are part of a shared spirituality that I would root inside of the Jesus narrative. Right, so I'm really interested in as best I can find it from my own angle where I am situated in the world and the kind of Jesus story that's available to me, I'm really interested in the Jesus kind of spirituality and how I could connect and to live in that as a master teacher, kind of big brother protege to go on a certain way of life, right? So that's become intriguing to me. And then my own analysis is that there's religion is the organized structures that people put around their interpretation of those paths and ways over time, and that those are often tend to be different in their structure than the spirituality itself, right? As someone would find it. So I can be very comfortable, living in a kind of Jesus-infused way without having to buy into all the other people's expressions of all of that business. I'm interested in what you think about that in the work that you're doing. Is that someone like me saying, well, Doug, the problem is you haven't done enough of your own internal soul work, so you're outsourcing it to this other imagination you have because that's a way that you feel more safe rather than dealing with your own fears? Or do you think there's something else going on? Or I don't know, or anything. Just any thoughts you have around that. I've been working on articulating this for a while. I wanted Kent Dobson's. I'm not going to send you $150, but I'm going to let this be my spiritual
all right.
worker session.
Wow. Well, first of all, let me quote from Jung, or sort of like say something. I'll hint at something he said. So if right now we could take away all of the narratives, religious language, rituals, rites of passage, take it all away, it's gone. All right, boom. We've never heard of Jesus. No cross, nothing like that. What would happen? Well, he suggests that the deep structure of the psyche would spontaneously produce what we would call religious or spiritual experiences. Partly because that's what it always is doing. And then out of that would come, over time, a whole new set of images, stories, narratives that might possibly become a religion, or religions or spiritual paths. So the important part about that is that something in us, something in us, or maybe another way to say it, a seed deep in our own souls is there that can produce, and I don't know what the relationship is necessarily with God. Let's leave God out of it, but let's just say something happens internally with our experience of the world that you and I might call spiritual experiences. And it's largely through images and symbols. And that would be the way we would come to explain it. Like Christianity is a religion, like they all are, of symbols. So, now, having said that, we cannot help the way we were born into the world. None of us are born with a blank slate. We have archetypal patterns and structures. We have, I don't know your family of origin, but like your parents and grandparents, they had stories and they had religious language, or they didn't. Something shaped them. We don't come in as a blank slate. We come in with unfinished business. This is called the collective unconscious. So given that, of course, we're going to find our way into sometimes recognizable religious traditions or patterns or even disciplines, or we might name our experiences like, let's say I have like a divine moment of some sort, but I might call that Christ consciousness or the mind of Christ. Why? Because that's what I inherited. I inherited even the symbols and images before I was born. They're in our like DNA, if you want to put it that way. At least this is some of the theory. So now, why am I saying all that? I think it's very important to pay attention to what you're curious about. And what you just described was you're curious about Jesus, right? You're interested in his way of being in the world and his spirituality. And you have to, in a sense, trust that curiosity. And one of the things that Joseph Campbell said is that once we start a kind of soul descent, guides appear. And they can be physical guides, like they could
say that
be,
phrase again. So what? I sound like Oprah right now. Hang on, say that again. Right. Once we start a soul descent. Talk about that sentence, because it feels like that's really an important part of what you're about to say. What does that mean, a soul descent?
Very simply, it is the beginning of the second half of life, where that's a Richard Rohr kind of phrase. But it's where you say, hey, my social roles, identity, even religious tradition, like imagine Jesus, like just being a carpenter, that has come to an end for some reason. And it's time to go into the deeper dive of, wait, who am I? Who am I really? Not who do people think I am, or, whatever, like, the social egoic persona that you've worked so hard to craft. Soul descent is about losing that. But the moment that begins to happen, at least according to Joseph Campbell, guides appear. All this, the great narrative stories and myths say some kind of guide appears. Maybe for Jesus, it was John the Baptist, it was like, all right, I'm going to follow this guy for a while. And he did, apparently, at least there are hints of it that he was kind of a follower of John, but, and the same goes with, maybe Jesus is a kind of guide for you. But it's interesting. It's interesting because soul descent is about eventually finding your own way of being in the world, not follow Jesus. I'm just going to do it like he did it. That maybe can get the wheels turning.
Yeah.
But even Jesus doesn't like that. He's like, no, you guys go out and do it. And then eventually he's like, I'm out of here.
Yeah. And do even greater things than these, right? Jesus said, I'm going to borrow that. He's got even a sort of like, that's not the point, doing.
That's right. Yeah.
Doing cover versions of this.
Yeah. Otherwise you're a cover band, which has its merits. You're like, oh, I guess they did a pretty good job with Pink Floyd, but it's certainly not Pink Floyd.
Right. Manfred Mann's covers of Spirit in the Night and Blinded by the Light are fantastic versions of Bruce Springsteen songs. I mean, they're better, but Manfred Mann was no Bruce Springsteen in the E Street Band. There's a reference for the second half of life for old people. Kent, the things you're describing, that way of being, the things you've personally experienced, the things you describe in the heralded book, Bitten by a Camel, they're incredibly or significantly, maybe I should say, personal and internal narratives and work that's going on that people are participating in. So much of people's spirituality in modern day life tries to incorporate a communal narrative into that, right? They want to be part of a community. They want to be part of a people. They want to join a church or be in a yoga class, or they want to go through teacher training to become a yogi with another set of people, or they want to get together at conferences. And I'm wondering about your thoughts on that sort of collective way of understanding ourselves and these individual, personal, internal kinds of engagements that you seem to describe here and in other conversations we've had and in the book Bitten by a Camel as a much more personally guided or personally traveled path.
Well, first a caveat, I might be wrong, because I'm going to say some strong things, but I might be wrong. These are just my intuitions and a little bit of people who have influenced me. So during adolescence, and I mean that kind of psychically, not just the time when you're like a teenager, your major concerns are twofold and they feel like opposites. One is like a question of who am I? Like, like what teenager doesn't say, no, really, man, I'm just trying to find myself.
Yeah, you don't even know me, Dad.
Yeah, exactly. And the other is, where do I fit in? And usually that's the one that takes precedence. I will know who I am by who is in my tribe. It's part of growing up. It's totally natural, 100% okay, and it cannot be skipped. That's what I would say. So part of how I would explain people's desire for community, which sometimes can be a bit sentimental if we're kind of honest about it. Actually, Cynthia Bourgeois was once asked about community, and she said, well, I think most people have kind of a sentimental view of it. But I would sort of situate a lot of that desire.
People say that about marriage, too. They actually have sentimental.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. I like that.
But anyway, so I guess I would locate a lot of those desires in the desires of early to late adolescence, which is tribal. Ken Wilber would call it probably the tribal sort of instinct. And you know yourself by who you're not. Like if you're in the yoga tribe, you're not in some other one, if you're Christian Reformed or Catholic, and the list goes on, progressive or not progressive. It's our entire political structure is junior high playground. What group am I in? What clothes do I wear? Who's the leader? Who gets picked last? All that kind of stuff. And I would say it's needed on one level. It does actually help because it starts to probe a question of your inner values, or even you might even say true self, because you might find yourself in a community. You're like, I cannot stand this anymore. My values have changed, shifted. So you immediately go out and look for a different one. You leave the evangelical church and you become an Episcopal or, whatever.
Right. You're not the senior pastor of a mega church anymore. You're the
you're just like
spiritual teacher
doing some spiritual community thing, Exactly.
Yeah.
And the question becomes, how committed are you to your sense of identity being situated in a community? And what I'm saying is once that runs out, then you've entered from a mythic point of view, the period of wandering. And that leaving home, Joseph Campbell called it. You become a wanderer. And that is other way to put it, is a lonely venture. It's not 2 by 2. It's not me and my, significant other. It's not me and 5 people who started a, church in our basement. We're talking about wandering and the ingredient of loneliness. It comes with the territory, which is why a lot of people don't want to do it. They say, nah, I don't want to be lost. We think about how much Christianity is about, we're going to save people who are lost.
Yeah.
I want to say, no, we want to let them be lost. Let us be lost. Because it's just, and that's part of growing up. That doesn't mean you're lost and you're a wanderer forever, because at least according to Campbell and others, you go through seasons of loneliness. Like this is Jesus, 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, so that in a deeper sense who you are, and you bring that back to the community. And oftentimes you end up starting things that have never been seen before. That's like Jesus.
Yeah. Lose your life, you'll find it. That kind of
thing. What Jesus started could have never, ever come into the world without this period of breaking with so-called community, wandering around for a while.
Leaving father and mother that business.
Yeah. And actually they thought he was insane, and then generating this kind of whatever he was doing, kingdom of God, small tribe, band of misfits. I don't know.
Yeah, right. Well, 2,000 years ago, fantastic marketers. I mean, he didn't know that was coming, but as it turns out, there was a real benefit coming down the line. Okay. So let me ask you, think of a gentle way to put this. For what purpose? Why? What is it that is at all helpful, useful, meaningful about people doing this, right? I have that kind of activist, world changer, there's real problems in the world, we should fix them kind of thing going on in my head. And what's the advantage to a person finding this path that you're describing of themselves and leaving home and wandering and being lost and having to leave all that behind just to find themselves toward what end? How are you thinking about that that question?
Okay.
Why do that?
Have you ever heard the poem by Adrian Rich called "Prospective Immigrants, Please Note"?
No.
Okay.
No, are you going to read it?
Yeah, this is it. It's not long. Prospective immigrants, please note. Either you will go through this door or you will not go through. If you go through, there is always the risk of remembering your name. So there she says it right at the beginning. You're going to remember something, and it's risky. And she calls it your name. She might mean something like true self, soul. She goes on. It's not a long poem. Things look at you doubly, and you must look back and let them happen. If you do not go through, it's possible to live worthily, to maintain your attitudes, to hold your position, to die bravely. And here's why you might want to go. So, in other words, you can live a great life, a worthy life, but she says, but much will blind you, much will evade you. At what cost, who knows? The door itself makes no promises. It is only a door. So that's the poem. So why go, so to speak? Because what if who you are on the deepest level and what you are to do or be in the world is there's still an element of archaeology, and there's still more yet to be uncovered. What will it cost you? At what cost? Who knows? But something, you'll miss something, is what she's saying in this poem. You'll miss something. It's not that you can't have have a good life. It's worthy, die bravely, but something deeper is going to evade you. At least that's what I think she's hinting around about. And then, I don't know, when you get that itch, which feels like a call, you can resist the call for sure. But it's going to keep knocking at the door. And I think it happens, culturally too, transpersonally. I think a lot of people are like, wait a minute, this is it. No, this cannot be it. And they mean that personally, and they mean that communally. It's probably like, a mixture of those two. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what,
yeah, no, I think it's, yeah. And I'm not even sure I was asking a question as much as sort of expressing the dilemma that, because as an organizer, somebody who organizes people in my life, right? I've realized as a personality, I think you have some of this too. I like get people together to do things, have this conversation, be part of a church community, do some work internationally, help kids that don't have enough people on their side. Try to, I don't know. I'm always sort of organizing people up for getting together and doing some things, and that kind of temperament and personality that a lot of people have, and they're the organizers in their lives, sometimes can feel the burden that life is supposed. Part of that same temperament comes with the burden they feel. Life is supposed to have a meaning, and we're supposed to make a contribution in the world. Right. And for a long time, it has been a curious question in the religious tradition, like, did you remember that little phrase? Don't be a human doing, be a human being. That
I do.
Yeah. So anyway, the idea was don't just be about doing, there's a sense of being that is more legitimate to who you are than the sort of one that is activating and active in the world. So I've got that sort of pressure on one side. I think a lot about that. And then there's other people that are like, Hey, people are too heavenly minded in the religion world to be of any earthly good, and people are too inner working to actually think about and care for somebody else. There's a lot of cares in the world. What we ought to do is take all that energy and put it to good use, right? It's really easy to critique churches that way. It's easy to critique the self-help movement that way. And so I think a lot about that question, right? Which I'm not sure it rests in everyone. I'm not sure everybody even has that sort of gnawing kind of question about how much self-care or self-exploration or spirituality they're supposed to be doing in the world versus how much contribution to the world they're supposed to make, right? The religious side of being a missional church that doesn't exist for your own purpose, but exists to be a benefit and blessing to the world and to make a contribution to the world and join with other people. So I wonder about how you, because I appreciate your perspective so much in this, how you talk about all of those things together.
Well, first of all, I mean, I recognize and resonate with the tension that you're describing, doing and being. And I think maybe it's a bit unfair, but I think some people are a little more wired to naturally follow one path over another,
right.
you know? Right. And so we just say, okay, that's fine. No problem. That's not a problem. But I will say that at a certain point, prioritizing what I would call soul helps inform the very things you are to do in the world. Mm. And sometimes you have to stop doing to figure out what that is. What does the soul want to bring forth in the world? That's a hard question to answer. And it requires some struggle. I think it requires some tears and some missteps. And it's not about, of course, like getting it right or something. But I think a lot of people find themselves sometimes even doing great things. Like, I mean, like when I was a mega church pastor, thousands of people are listening and probably learning something, I think. And that's not a bad thing in the world. It's probably causing more good than harm. It's probably causing some harm. But it wasn't mine to do. It wasn't mine to hold anymore in that way. And so, and rather than quick swap it out with something else, to begin the conversation, that's what I would say, the conversation around what does the soul want? What does nature want? What does the deep self want? What does the true self want to bring forth, to be in the world? And actually, I think you can tell when people are more soul oriented. And here's how you can tell. They have less attachment to the thing that they're doing.
Oh,
like they could change it out tomorrow. It's no big deal. Like they could be like, hey, I have like 100,000 followers on my Facebook account. And then all of a sudden they just shut it down, you know, like, oh, I'm going to do something else.
Yeah.
Because their identity isn't situated in the product. They are simply, their soul is like finding its voice, like singing its song in the way it's singing its song. But you can tell when people aren't very rooted probably in their true self. That's hard to make that judgment when they have a lot of clinging to the thing they're doing. Their identity is too hooked in it. Yeah. Which is why, by the way, a good failure helps get things going for a lot of people, myself included.
Because you're reminded in a good failure that you're just living in an illusion about how important the thing you're doing is? Is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like think about all these megachurch pastors that get caught, you know, sleeping around or whatever. What a gift. You know, that's what I think. What a gift. Because suddenly the illusion is taken away. Yeah, they do. You know, boom, it's gone. I am no longer under the illusion that I am a committed whatever. Boom, gone.
Yeah. Well, actually, I've known a number of people in their that are in jobs in which their own, which they don't want to be in any longer. They don't have a lot of escape hatches, and there's a few levers you can pull that eject you from that circumstance and set of struggles and pain that you're in. And that's one of them. And there's a number of people I know who they've done that. And I think the kind of thing you're suggesting is it's much better to do that work ahead of time than to have to feel the struggle of that awareness coming to you against your will.
Yeah, I mean, it causes tremendous suffering. And sometimes I think the unconscious manufactures these kinds of things. I mean, you were describing people choose that and pull the lever. I agree. That happens. But sometimes I think it's like the unconscious can't handle it anymore and manufactures these crises, because you're neglecting something. You're living split. And that's bad for the soul. You might, that can cause illnesses, that kind of split off,
for sure.
Existence.
Okay, so one more, and some of these are true questions for me, and some of them are ones that I know a lot of people think about because I hear them ask these kinds of questions, and I don't want to tell you which is which, just because it's more fun to sound like I have these deep thoughts myself. This notion of self and true self feels super judgy to me, and I wonder if this notion that people pursuing what their true self is, as opposed to these other selves, is not the best way to organize our understanding of oneself, that maybe we're less like an orange, that you peel away the peeling to get to the fruit in the center, and the fruit is the true orange and the peeling is what covers it. And more like an onion, that the more as you peel an onion, you realize when you get to that final peel, there was nothing in the center of it. The onion was made up of these series of layers of onion. That maybe I'm just playing with the idea. What if there's not a true self? There's a series of personalities and experiences and ways of life that we have, and those all layer together, and that's all us. And really what we're doing is freeing some of our psychological personhoods and finding ones that are more positive for us, and allowing the ones that have been more damaging to us to be to go ahead and leave, and that it's less that there's a true thing in there. We're on a treasure hunt to find it and to free it, and we're not going to try to rescue the true self that's in distress at the top of a castle, and we're going to do the heroic work of finding the true self. What if there's another way to think about it that's less true self and other things are ego, and there's kind of this internal good and bad, and get rid of the false you and live in the real you? All that stuff seems like, wow. Well, I just feel like people I know, and myself included, are really complicated, and there's a lot of me's in the world, and I'm trying to figure out how to live at peace with all of them, as opposed to claiming one as true and the others as not. How do you think about that?
Well, first of all, yeah, I mean, right on. I actually think true self, false self can be really a pretty small view. And actually the ego would like nothing more than there to be a so-called true self and a false self, because the ego knows itself by comparison. So it's just going to, I'm about the true self, and suddenly you're like a spiritual ego. I figured it out. I'm acting from my true self, instead of my false ones. That sounds like bullshit, So like anything, you have to hold them, even the notion, as a kind of metaphor. And if you really are interested in a phrase like true self, start reading Merton, because he's the one that coined that phrase, if I'm not mistaken. And he has volumes dedicated to what you're describing, the complicated reality of just being a human being, and the dance that is required for, maybe the better way to say it is deepening a sense of trueness. And maybe we're the whole fruit. It's not like there's a center that's, more, you're right. Maybe it is the whole thing, but a truer sense of what that orange is to do in the world, that's maybe closer to true self. And actually, you know, Carl Jung said that the soul is an image. Now, that's hard for the mind to even comprehend. What does that mean? The soul is an image. But one of the nice things about that idea is that it's an image doesn't have a single meaning. It's just shaped in a certain way. There's a color to it. There's nuance to it, that you're shaped in the world in a certain way. Just like, you know, a deer, a rabbit or something has a certain shape, color, camouflage, and acts in the world in a certain way. And a lot of that is unconscious. And really what we're describing as like going after the true self is really dipping into the unconscious, into the layers beneath who you think you are. Because that's the ego game. You know, I am this, I am this, I am this, until you're not, you know. And then you're dipping your toes into the unconscious, and maybe potentially closer to the image of who you are in the world. Like the Buddhist phrase, the face you had before you were born. You know, that's alluring, you know. Is that true? I want to say, is that true? The face you had before you were born. And so the kind of, and I think the great myths and stories are about luring us into the forest to discover that again, our true name, you know, that at least that's, you know, I'm going to say that, I was about to say that's my opinion, but I'm just like collecting up bits and pieces of writers and authors and storytellers and people I trust and from my own experience. But I think, I mean, to just kind of come back to the beginning of what you were asking, I think there's a lot of danger in saying, hey, let's go on the journey to find the true self. I do. I agree. There's some danger in that. It feels very egoic and possessive and judgy, as you said. Probably it's better to say, I don't know anything about this. Then we can start.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of power in people being able to say, hey, there's been a lot of expectations or ways of understanding myself that have been put on me, and I'm having to sort through all of those, and many of them don't fit me anymore. And I'm going to shed those. I'm going to shed those old clothes. You know, I'm going to shed that old identity. I don't want to live that way anymore. I have found I've worked different jobs in my life, and I've had lots of different business cards. And for some reason, I like little business cards. I never carry them around, but I make them. It's the weirdest thing. So I have all these business cards, and I'll find them on a shelf, and I'll pull one out, and I'll be like, oh my gosh, remember when I was that guy? Remember when I was the guy that worked for that effort, or I worked at that organization, and that's the thing I said to people, I am this person with that title and that set of expectations around me. I'm not that person anymore. And I used to say I was that person, and I'm not anymore. Like, that power is so alluring, I think, so important for all of us. I don't know why I get hung up on this idea that people, that if we're not careful, there's another kind of struggle and shame that comes in when we think, so I need to find the real me, the one I'm going to stay with the whole time. You know,
yeah.
I don't, people will say stuff like that. Like, well, are you going to do something today that 50 years from now you'd still be proud of? I'm like, I don't know. I kind of hope that, 20, 30 years from now, if I live that long, I'm going to look back on my life and think, oh, I was an interesting enough version of myself, but I don't know. I think I kind of like the way I am now. And I sure don't want to have this be the true self that I found, and now I'm holding on to true. So I don't know. I think it's super complicated.
Yeah. Oh, well, let me just add one quick metaphor. Like, something that helps me is I will sometimes think about it in terms of voice, like a musician finding his voice. I mean, think about Neil Young. Like he went through his 1980s synthesized era, and that's what he was doing then. But the process, there, and to keep writing albums, keep making albums, is in part the process of discovering your voice. Mm-hmm. And every once in a while you start singing notes and you're like, that's not me.
Yeah.
It might take you a while. You might say, no, I'm all about 80s synthesized music. And then 10 years later, you're like, well, I don't know what that was. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so just finding voice, finding the song that only you can sing, or whatever Shakespeare says about, or not, that's not Shakespeare. You may contribute a verse. Who is that?
Oh, Whitman. I think it's a Whitman quote. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a question. That's the great human question. What is the verse you are to contribute in the world? And all I'm saying is, let's talk about that. Let's talk about if you feel like you're singing the song you were born to sing or not. Let's talk about, okay, you're successful or not successful doing whatever it is that you're doing. Is that satisfactory to you? Is that, or do you feel like there's something more? And then all of a sudden you're poking around. It's not like, I suppose the voice ages too, it changes a bit. But I think you do want to be in the process of becoming comfortable, learning what it's like to be you. And to sing the song that only you can sing.
So I think I think this has been very helpful. Thank you, by the way. I think I'm starting to understand why I like your perspective so much. What it is that you do. You have this sense of talking about these things in a way that gives great value to the benefits that come when someone wanders. Other people talk about it feels to me, in a way that talks about how important it is to get to the journey, or to get to the valley or the mountaintop, whichever metaphor they're using. And you seem to talk about it as in, while you're going around, you're going to pick up some things as you're moving and going and doing what you're doing and exploring the things you're exploring. But you're not really suggesting go to the place where you're going to find the real you. You're not talking, there's no like climb to the mountain peak and get the thing you get at the peak, which ironically now I'm realizing, well, that's what your book Bitten By A Camel starts out with in that first story. Maybe this is why. So people should buy that book so they can hear that story. But am I tapping into something there that you have this perspective that the goodness comes from the wandering as opposed to just the journeyed trek that you're on? Like, you're not an explorer trying to get to the North Pole. You're like, I don't know, let's go.
Yeah. And actually, it is true. I'm influenced by Joseph Campbell and the quote hero's journey, but that's only one of the monomyths, as he called it. Sometimes the journey destination, that's a little bit too Western right now. I mean, it really is like, we're going to go and conquer now the true self.
Yeah. That's
bring that sucker back. Right. I mean, that's the adolescent,
like your big journey. Game hunters or something. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so that's not what I have in mind. And maybe there are other myths and stories that are more important. As you were speaking, I was thinking about, there's a story about 4 rabbis, and they want to see the sacred wheel of Ezekiel. All right. In other words, they want to have a mystical experience.
Yeah.
And all 4 are caught up into the sacred mystical wheel of Ezekiel. And one comes back and he's insane. He drools the rest of his life and just fumbles around. One person comes back and says, I don't know what that was. Like, that's just like a dream, or that wasn't real. I made it up.
Yeah.
One person comes back and they begin teaching fervently everything that they experienced on their mystical mountaintop, and how it works and how you too can get there, and their whole life. And the 4th rabbi just goes home and goes about his life. And sometimes he writes poems. Sometimes he tends his garden. Sometimes he raises his kids. Sometimes he goes to synagogue. Sometimes he doesn't. One day he writes a book. The next day he changes his mind and writes something different. And he begins to, in a sense, incorporate in the everyday, ordinary normalness of life a bit of this mysterious thing that happened to him. And the reason why I like that story is because the kind of stuff we're talking about, it's not about becoming an expert in it or conquering it, or it's just learning little glimpses of your own sacred wheel and beginning to find your own natural way of putting that forth. I mean, it could be you start a restaurant, or you homeschool your kids, or you
look yourself in the eye in the morning.
Yeah. And you're like, I can do that.
Yeah, right.
So and one more thing about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, it's humiliating. You can tell if it's real if it's humiliating, rather than it's something to be bragged, or be like, I did it. I had the dark night of the soul, and now I'm just killing it. No, it's humiliating. It's it's hard to talk about, and
wow,
that's the kind of thing I trust. Like when someone is humiliated, I think, all right, now I'm listening. Like he says, you go out to slay the dragon, and you yourself are slayed, or you slay yourself, I think is actually technically what he says. But in other words, you go out to be victorious and you're conquered. When that happens, that's the kind of humiliation I'm talking about on the soul level. And that's where all the fertile ground, that's death and resurrection, back to Jesus, who you thought you were has to die and before something can begin to grow again.
Well, friends, that's Kent Dobson. I refer to Kent as master teacher. Am I the only one that's ever given you that title? Because it's
yes,
supposed to stick well. Well, master teacher Kent Dobson. The book is Bitten by a Camel. It's about this, don't you think? What would you say so?
And it has some specific religious overtones about growing up in evangelical Christianity, and the stuff that, at least one of the metaphors is, a lot of the baggage, specific ideas that I was carrying around on the back of a camel, so to speak, had to come off. So in part the book is about shedding a few layers, and it's kind of personal in that sense.
Yeah, and I will add to that I think what's great about it, and the way that you incorporate these things together, is that a lot of people who have certain religious experiences tend to believe that their own upbringing isn't all that impressive compared to other people's, so they don't think that it counts as a legitimate starting place, right? They've sort of become a little embarrassed by it, and so they want to kind of downplay it and have this other kind of spiritual history that they're tapping into, right? I think you and a number of other authors do a really good job of saying, hey, the history that you've experienced, that's yours, and that's just as legitimate as anyone else's experience. And sometimes even for oneself, not being able to include your own story as a legitimate starting place by kind of minimizing it, or like, well, I was just raised, fill in the blank. So, I didn't really have one of those. It's a strange way to dismiss one's own sense. And I get it, because a number of people feel that way. A lot of people I know feel that way if they grew up without the kind of rich, tapestry. Boy, if I could just be Anne Lamott, that would really be great, and have, some much more dramatic kind of history, and not just a kid raised in some private Christian school or Catholic school or Hebrew school or something, and that's, they had parents that loved them and tried to help them follow God, and that kind of thing. Just seems like, I didn't have the kind of childhood, and it was just, I don't know, it was all kind of dumb. And now I'm trying to find the real thing, and I think what you raise in the book and the things you do is, no, that's real stuff right there. That's as real as it gets. It's It's
one's ordinary life as the beginning and the end.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sort of. Okay. We should wrap it up here. But did you ever pay attention to that movie, The Last Temptation of Christ?
Yeah, I've seen it a couple times.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of has that feel, right? Like that the Jesus agenda ends up with him kind of living his life into old age, and he can't figure out why everybody in that storyline, why everybody wants to have a much better ending and a much better beginning, right? As opposed to make your contribution, you move on, you rest well, and then others follow in your way.
Yeah, I've never thought about it that way. That's probably true.
Yeah,
in that story. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, there's a thing going on there. Hey, Kent Dobson book, Bitten by a Camel and Other Things, KentDobson.com. Kent's going to be launching his own podcast soon, right?
It's up. It's up. You can listen to it. I have like 10 episodes maybe.
It's up in public. What's it called for people that like to
you could probably just find it under Kent Dobson, but it's technically called Hints and Guesses.
Hints and Guesses.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. So Hints and Guesses, Kent Dobson. Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, man.